Good afternoon, everybody. It is day 43, church in the time of quarantine. It's a quarantine. I don't know why I have so much trouble with that word. I say it every day. You think I should get good at it. It's April 28th, and on this day in 1937, Saddam Hussein was born. And on this day in 1945, Benito Mussolini was killed. So a dictator is born and a dictator is killed. I don't know how many dictators that nets you, but anyway, that's what happened today. Reminder: church cleanup is scheduled for this Saturday, and according to my weather app right here, Saturday appears. There we go. There we go. Yeah, 69 and partly cloudy. So I think we should be good for the cleanup day. But like I said, also if you just want to go and do some stuff yourself, you are more than welcome to do that. Not on Saturday. So just be raking, weeding, pruning, shining, whatever else you can think of to do there. And then tomorrow, soup drop-off between 4 and 5:30, and we'll have the blessing of the soups when they are all there. So if you've signed up for that, appreciate it, and thanks for helping out with this wonderful ministry. And that brings us to trivia. We had a winner from yesterday. If you remember yesterday's question, it was: in what city was Archduke Franz Ferdinand assassinated starting the First World War? That city was Sarajevo, which would later be famous for hosting the Olympics and then the unpleasantness after that. But Sarajevo, that's where ground zero for World War I. Okay, on to today's trivia. Since, again, we still do not have baseball, we'll do a little baseball trivia. As most everyone knows, the Chicago Cubs went the longest without having won a World Series, going 107 years before winning the World Series in 2016. So now that they have gotten rid of this distinction, what team now has gone the longest without having won a World Series? And that is 71 years. What team has gone 71 years without having won a World Series? So if you know that, send that in, and we can all pretend we're watching baseball. Okay, well, with that, we're going to have part 2 of the interview with Father Grosso. Hope you're enjoying it, and I will talk to you all soon. Thanks. Bye.
Yeah.
Well, good. I want to go back. You kind of touched on it a little bit when you talked about the chair and all that. So if we get reductionist, completely, let's say, if I look out the window and it's cloudy outside, but that requires me to have faith that my eyes are telling me correct things about what I see outside,
Right.
that I know what a cloud is, what
Right.
I've been told is a cloud is really a cloud, so is everything ultimately require faith?
In the qualified sense that I was using earlier, faith as purposeful action, I would say yes, because fundamentally speaking, there is no action that we ever undertake, even something as simple as looking out the window to check the weather, that does not involve our dependence and our dependence on and our commitment to processes about which we have no understanding whatsoever. Give you an example, using the example that you just used. I turn my head, I look out the window, I see something happening outside, and I draw a conclusion on the basis of my visual experience. I don't know how my eyes work. I'm not an ophthalmologist. I mean, really. I don't know all the ins and outs and all the intricacies of how my body processes information from the world around me. But I trust that it does. And my everyday experience confirms that it's pretty reliable. And that, when I listen to my body in certain ways, when I pay attention to what's in front of me, my body works pretty well. But I don't understand any of that. I have to pretty much just take it for granted that my body knows what it's doing when it looks out the window. And I have to take it for granted that it's me controlling my body and not some other force, right? I mean, this is, there was a kind of a famous philosophical argument regarding why we should be skeptical about sense experience. How do you know you're not being deceived by a demon, right? How do you know that you're not either being forced to do something against your will without knowing that you're being forced to do something against your will? Or how do you know you're not being presented with a sensory experience that is not really happening? Well, okay, fine. I mean, if we want to play that game, at the end of the day, yes, it's conceivable I'm being deceived by a demon. But all of my experience tells me to the contrary. Right? When every bit of evidence I have tells me otherwise, I'm not sure that argument is tremendously helpful. So in that qualified sense, Yes, I would say that everything we do depends on a measure of faith. Now, I'd also have to say, though, that different kinds of action involve different degrees of faithfulness. It takes little to nothing for me to turn my head, look out the window, and make a conclusion based on my sensory experience about what's going on outside. It takes a little bit more intention, a little bit more trust in order for me to walk across the room and put myself down in a chair that I've never encountered before, expecting that it's going to hold my weight. It takes a little more faith for me to enter into a covenant relationship with someone in a relationship, in a bond of marriage that I expect is going to continue indefinitely, right? It takes a little more faith to commit myself to a God who could conceivably demand everything of me. So the idea that there's just kind of that faith operates at one level, or that it operates the same at all the levels of our experience, is something that I think, again, culturally we need to get over. Faith is operative at every level of our experience, but faith operates to different degrees and in different ways at every level of our experience. And so too does reason. So too does reason.
Well, you talked about the, faith in God being, higher up, and having known you for, I don't know how many years we're up to these days, but anyway, you are one of the most reasonable people, and I mean that in a sense that you see.
You need to talk to my wife.
We can interview her next.
You obviously don't know anything about me. That's right.
Now you're questioning our friendship.
Far be it for me to do that.
Yeah, but could you just talk on a personal note how you came to faith in Christianity?
Yeah. I grew up in the church, so I really can't remember a time in my life when some form of faith has not been operative. I don't think I was very intentional about my faith for a very long time, simply because it was part of the wallpaper. Going to church was what my family did, and here we are, and now we're going to sing these songs, and now we're going to do this thing, and then we're going to go home, and life will go on. So I've always kind of there's been a dimension of my faith that has always enabled me to take the faith for granted. And that's both been helpful and potentially limiting. It wasn't until probably my late high school, college years that I began thinking a little bit more about whether or not the tradition I was worshiping in was indeed the tradition that I felt called to worship in, and whether or not I really believed any of this stuff anyways. And it was right about that time, actually, it was when I went to college, that I first discovered people practicing Christian scholarship. I had the great privilege to do two and a half of my undergraduate years at Calvin in Grand Rapids. And I'd never seen somebody or heard somebody talk about Christian philosophy or Christian psychology or Christian art or Christian music, or, people at Calvin were doing things from a Christian perspective in pretty much every dimension of scholarly endeavor. And I'd never seen that before. And that opened my eyes to the extent to which and the ways in which you could really think about your faith, and you could really kind of enter into a really robust consideration of what it meant to say, I believe in God, the Father, et cetera, the whole of the Nicene Creed. So it was, to some degree, the introduction of the application of reason to the faith that brought me into a fuller sense of what it meant to be a Christian, and helped confirm for me that Christianity, yes, was indeed the path to which I was called, and the path that helped me make the best sense of God and the world and myself and everything else. So it's for this reason that I think that the whole question of the relationship between faith and reason is definitely not just an academic one for me. It was, in many respects, that question at a very broad level that helped me live into the faith in a way that helped me make it my own, or rather helped me recognize the extent to which God has made me his own.
Well, going, I guess, kind of slightly, I thank you for that. That was very, it reminds me a bit of my own journey somewhat there. But there was a while kind of in, we don't need to go into my whole story, but where I kind of got I kind of thought apologetics was really neato, that we have this argument for, and you can sit down and, you read the argument that this is why God exists and this is why the Christian God, and this is, and I found myself as I've gotten older, I'm not against what the apologists do, but I guess I'm not sure how helpful it is to, what I mean by that is you take a complete atheist, go, oh, here, read this book. You'll be a Christian
Right,
by the time you're through.
right,
Um,
right, right.
and I think that's how I was probably approaching it, years ago. And now I guess I find myself in this sort of uh, muddled understanding, like I said, not against, arguments for the faith, but what's your view? Are they helpful? Is it more sort of inside sports that all of us, who are already Christian go, yeah, or is it something that's useful to the wider world?
I think it turns on the difference whether or not we think of apologetics in terms of confession or compulsion. I think that you end up taking a different apologetic stance whether you understand the apologetic task to be one of confession or one of compulsion. What I mean by that is this: if by apologetics we mean confession, then what apologetics involves is simply the unpacking and the elaboration of the faith. Here's why we believe what we believe. This is what you need to know about the Christian faith in order to understand it. Because if you're rejecting it, or if you're accepting it, or whatever your stance towards it is going to be, let us make sure that you are aware of what it is you're accepting or rejecting or living or whatever it is. That's apologetics as confession. This is why we think this about God. This is why we think this about Jesus. This is why we think this about salvation. The other approach is to think of apologetics as a means of compulsion. You have to be a Christian because you have to think about God in this way, and you have to think about Jesus in this way, and you have to think about yourself in this way. And it's not that the rationale changes from one to the other, but the tone is significantly different there. I don't think you can ever really coerce or compel or beat someone into faith. I mean, that just doesn't seem to be the way that our Lord works. But I do think you can confess. And out of that confession, I think you can evoke a faithful response in someone else who would also be willing to confess. So I think there is a place in the church for apologetics. There's an absolute desperate crying need for apologetics if what that task is about is the confession and the elaboration of the faith. The minute that task becomes the compulsion of faith, I think it begins to look a little bit different. Then I think it begins to look less productive. I'm reminded here, I mean, we recently came through Lent and of course Holy Week and the Triduum and Passion of our Lord and all the rest of it. And I'm reminded about the example of Jesus. The closer he got to the culmination of his ministry, the closer he got to the cross, the more silent he became. Because I think he knew that the closer he got to the cross, the more he would have to rely on compulsion in order to get people to recognize who he was. As he's making his way down from Galilee into Jerusalem, he's talking to everybody and their brother. Anybody who will listen, he's confessing, this is what's going on. This is what's happening. This is what God is doing in my life. This is what God is doing in me. And this is by consequence what God is doing in your life. Repent and believe, for the kingdom is at hand. The closer he gets to the cross, the less he says. Because the closer he gets to the cross, the more it becomes obvious that for him to compel belief, he's going to have to call on legions of angels, right? As he tells us, I can call on 10,000 legions of angels to get me out of this if I want to. Is that really what you're asking me to do right now? Right? Do we want to play that scenario? I'm not going to do that, right? At this point, I can't compel you. So my most eloquent confession right now is silence. So I think as long as that distinction is kept in mind, and as long as our apologetic strategy is always one that is oriented towards confession, I think apologetics has a vital, important role to play in the faith and practice of the church. It's when we try to compel belief that even in ourselves, it's when we try to force ourselves into a new level of faithfulness that we believe God is calling us to that we don't even understand. Well, why are we doing this? Well, because we have to, because of the intensity of the belief. Let's bring a little reason into play here. 3 steps forward, yes. Take a couple steps back, look at it, clarify it, confirm it, and then let's move forward again.
Good. Yeah, no, I think that's that's helpful because I think in my, well, that would be saying I'm mature in faith now, but in my very immature, I guess I'm less, was the idea that, if I remember John Keegan, who military historian, but he had this story about when he was a child during World War II, and he had this belief that if he could just get in the room with Hitler, he could explain to him the futility of everything he was doing, and the war would be over. And that idea of apologetics, I yeah. So well,
now you're back to the cross-cultural rationality question, right?
yeah,
If we were to sit down with Adolf Hitler, could we explain to him the reasons why what he's doing is wrong? Probably not, because the framework within which the actions that he undertook were situated, it made perfect sense to him why he was doing what he. I mean, but there's something about that should terrify us, because what that tells us is that we are capable of so deceiving ourselves. We are capable of using our reason in ways that will lead us to do things that are horrifying. And we will have the best of intentions and the best possible arguments in the world for doing so. We will feel completely justified in doing so. Hitler didn't wake up and think, okay, it's time for me to be a tyrant.
yeah.
It's time for me to be a murderer.
As one of my friends says, never get in an argument with a crazy person because it all makes sense to them.
That's right. In someone's world, this works.
Yeah. So, but that kind of leads into that we talked about levels of faith and reason and all that. You're saying that in some people's world it's reasonable. It all makes perfect sense. So, so if this level of faith, does it take more faith to believe in God or to believe that people are reasonable and that?
Yeah.
And,
I have lots of faith in God. I don't have much faith in human rationality. Let's put it that way. I mean, if there's one thing that the history of the world demonstrates, even the history of the church, if there's one thing that our history, that the history of our species demonstrates, it's that we have an infinite capacity for self-deception. Which is why, I mean, not incidentally, that's why I think the relationship between the question of God and the nature of reason is so important, because if we don't keep God in the picture, then we lose sight of everything. If you abandon God, all bets are off. And reason is out the window, and truth is out the window, and goodness is out the window, and beauty is out the window, and it's every man for himself, right? That doesn't look to me like a good life, and it doesn't look to me like it's representative of the world in which we actually live, because the world in which we actually live is one that reveals itself in truth, and reveals itself in beauty, and reveals itself in goodness. So how do we account for that? We've got to keep God in the picture, because left to our own devices, and I'm thinking here, the quote that kind of John Calvin was famous for: the human mind is an idol factory. If we don't have something to worship, we will make it up. Whatever it is, animate, inanimate, we don't care. We will worship it because that's what we are. So we've got to keep God in view, or else our very rationality, our identity as human beings becomes corrupted.
That I don't know if Chesterton actually said it. It's always ascribed to him that if when man stops believing in God, it's not that he believes in nothing, it's he believes in anything.
There it is. There it is. That's exactly right. There's no such thing. I mean, to a certain extent, it's true to say there are no atheists in foxholes.
Yeah.
You will believe something. And the nature of your belief, whatever it is you believe, will be religious in nature. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The question is your belief accurate? Does your belief reflect reality? And the nature of the world is such that we all find ourselves in foxholes all the time. You don't have to be in trench warfare in Europe to be in a foxhole. I mean, think about social isolation and social distancing. It's a different kind of foxhole.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time. I just wonder if we could kind of wrap up with a question, if for further study, anything you'd recommend, that would be good books for people to read or resource.
I think we've said about all there is to say about this. I don't know that further study is even really, I mean, I think we've pretty much we've covered
it's
the
over.
Whole spectrum. That's right. There are no questions. If you wanted to kind of start with a classical Christian articulation of the nature of faith, you couldn't do much better than to start with Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas's Summa Theologia, the massive work for which he's best known, is divided into two parts, and the second part is itself divided into two parts. So the second part of Thomas's Summa is basically dedicated to the question of faith. What is faith? How does faith work? What's the relationship between faith and other forms of human understanding? All of that kind of stuff. So Thomas's treatment of faith in the Summa is probably the paradigmatic starting point for any Christian consideration of faith and reason. Obviously, there were people thinking about faith and reason long before Thomas, and obviously there have been people thinking about faith and reason since Thomas. But Thomas is a really good place to start because he kind of straddles all those worlds. Nicholas Walterstorff wrote a short book in the mid-70s called Reason Within the Bounds of Religion, which was his attempt to answer Immanuel Kant's earlier work written towards the end of the 18th century, Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone. Kant was trying to make a case for what it meant to be religious if we use critical reason as the foundation for all knowing, and didn't work terribly well. Walterstorff responded to Kant and did so in a way that demonstrated the relationship between faith and reason in a way that I think is more viable. So Walterstorff's Reason Within the Bounds of Religion is another helpful resource. H. Richard Niebuhr's book, Christ and Culture, is not specifically focused on the question of faith and reason, but the implications of what Niebuhr says about the relationship between Christ and culture bears, I think, on the way we understand the relationship between faith and reason. Niebuhr sets out 5 different ways of conceiving of the relationship between Christ and culture, and I think that you can use those 5 ways as ways of exploring the possible relationship between faith and reason. And then a much more recent and much more kind of accessible introduction to all of this stuff would be a book by a guy named James Sire called Why Should Anyone Believe Anything at All? Sire wrote that book. It's been over 20 years now. Sire did a series of works on Christian worldview, and one of the books in that series was specifically focused on the question of belief and whether or not it made any sense to believe in a world that is governed by facts and by knowledge. So Sire's book on why believe anything at all is another. But the literature is literally, it's a massive literature because it's a big problem for us right now culturally. So there've been a lot of people working on it. If you go to a library catalog and just subject line faith and reason, you'll get the phone book. So there's no want of material.
Yeah, but we've settled it now, so we can.
We're done.
Writing.
Yeah, we're done. Further questions, whatever.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking time to do this. It's
Thank you.
Good to see you. And
I've had a chance to spend some time with the people at St. John Chrysostom in the past. I mean, I've been a guest preacher there in the past, and you've graciously invited me to sub in for you, and Sundays you weren't able to be there. So I'm glad to be able to connect with them again and continue to be grateful for your friendship and for the ministry that you have amongst that congregation.
Well, thank you. Well, great to talk to you, and we'll catch up again soon.
Excellent. Thanks for inviting me.